Today's webinar is entitled, Will Return to Work Take Us Back or to the Future? And is brought to you by the European American Chamber of Commerce, where Europeans and Americans connect to do business. My name is Todd Schwartz. I'm the Executive Director of the Cincinnati chapter of the EACC, and I'll be your host today. We have nearly 100 registrants for today's event from around the world, so I'm sure we're going to have a vibrant and transatlantic and international discussion. One disclaimer. Please note that all comments and opinions presented by our speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or its members. I'm now going to hand over the event to my colleague, Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. Yvonne is the Executive Director of the New York chapter of the EACC. She's going to set the stage for our discussion and introduce our presenters. Yvonne, over to you.
Thank you, Todd. Good morning, everyone. As Todd said, I run the New York office of the EACC, and I would like to welcome everyone to our return to work discussion today. While working from home obviously has some advantages, I think it's safe to say that most of us are looking forward to getting back into a normal rhythm between work and our private life. And as we're opening our cities, states here in the US and country by country in Europe, we decided that it may be interesting to explore what steps are being taken on either side of the Atlantic and to bring us back to work safely. We asked Gerlind Wisskirchen of CMS, a German firm with offices across Europe, and Aaron Warshaw, he's on our legal committee, and a partner at OGLETREE, a mostly US-based employment law firm, to share what employers need to know and what they need to look out for to make sure that their employees are returning safely. And we do have a short survey that my colleague Todd is preparing that we're launching at the end of the program. I encourage everyone to participate in that. Also worth mentioning, as a member of the EACC, we will send out a follow-up email to everyone, and members can ask for connections to anyone who's participating in today's program. So do take advantage of that. I know it's harder to connect on an online format, but we are trying to make up for that by connecting you to the other participants via email. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Gerlind, who is going to, I think you're going to start first, or was it Aaron? Yeah.
No, it's me.
Yeah, okay, very good.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome from my side as well. As you can hear, I'm the European lawyer, and in Europe, we are just in the middle of returning to work. Some of you will have already started helping the workforce to return to work, and Aaron and I will try to show you what you need to do as an employer. And if we look on the agenda, we'll briefly discuss why we are maintaining work from home, why this could be an issue if you do it for good. However, what do you need to do in order to prepare the return to the workplace? And then we talk about in-office safety requirements as well as out-of-office safety precautions. We will walk you through what you need to do when you have suspicious or confirmed cases. And if there is time left, we would like to discuss the transition to maybe a new world of work. Having said that, maybe we will quickly start with the first question. Why could maintaining working from home be an issue? I mean, we have seen it in the past weeks. While most people agreed for the time being to stay at home, and I'm pretty sure that the financial controllers already made the math, how to cut costs when everybody stays at home and how to reduce the lease by reducing workspaces. On the other hand, we all see the cons. There is a lack of creativity. Many employees do not have an adequate work environment at home. Childcare could be a problem. We all see that virtual meetings are not as effective as physical ones. And in general, teamwork doesn't work that well. And maybe it's a European legal thing, but also when you want to ensure compliance with health and safety regulations, it's much harder to do so when people work from home. So I think we will return to the issue, but that's the opening statement, so to say. And the question is, why do you have to prepare the return to the workplace? And from a European point of view, and Aaron, please chime in if you see it differently, I think there are 4 reasons. One reason is a liability risk. There might be fines and imprisonment or at least damages be lurking. You have, as an employer, a duty of care for your employees. It's a general obligation across Europe. Then what I already mentioned, productivity issues might be at stake. And of course, last but not least, your reputation might be at stake if you do not follow up stringently the various health and safety regulations, at least here in Europe. Anything from your side? Why bother at all, Aaron?
No, that's it. I mean, it's very much in the U.S. still feels like an ad hoc approach and a company by company approach. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing is companies are essentially falling into 3 buckets. A small minority that fall out of essential services are mandating workers to come back and then dealing with all the employee relations around that. I think that's a very slim minority and frankly are getting some negative press in the U.S. What we're hearing more of is companies, and obviously I'm thinking more now of professionals such as all the folks on this webinar, who are making a voluntary return to work, where their workforce is finding working from home really challenging. They'd like to be able to go into the office. They're not subject to a state closure order, and they're making it voluntary. And then I'd say probably what the majority is still, if not mandating work from home, the expectation that the majority of the workforces are working from home. So I think we're further behind Europe. In some ways, we'll probably be looking to the European experiment in the coming months and to see how it goes. It's kind of a company by company approach is what I'm finding.
Yeah, it's interesting to see US-based companies having offices across Europe seem to lag behind the European companies, multinationals, because they want to treat everybody alike. So many of them have decided not to return to the office till fall, while the Europeans, many of them have already returned, depending on the country, obviously. Maybe we can walk through the questions that many employers typically have nowadays when people return to the workplace. First question is, do you have workers the right to refuse to come back to work out of fear of contracting COVID-19? So in Europe, one can safely say in no country you are allowed to refuse to go back to work unless there is an objective reason that you are a person at risk or living with somebody who is. So typically, our recommendation is, as an employer, ask your employees for a medical test certificate if they refuse to come to work. How is that in the US, Aaron? Is there?
Yeah, it's the same. And my apologies for any background noise. It's, my family is outside my door. Speaking of work from home challenges, it's the same. One of the debates in Congress that people may have read about is that the GOP in the Senate is pushing for essentially a blanket protection for negligence claims for people returning from work. It doesn't look like that's going to be passed. Okay. We are starting to see a handful of lawsuits over essentially workers that have been essential workers, so had to work in a workplace that deals with the public, have tested positive. Sometimes, unfortunately, there have been fatalities. It's not clear yet under typically be under U.S. state negligence laws, how those cases would work out. I can certainly say I think that companies that follow, CDC, OSHA, state health guidelines, take reasonable precautions, it's going to be hard for those claims to go anywhere or have success. But obviously the potential liability can be quite large depending upon the impact on the worker. So I think the answer is no. And you know, typically we would tell companies if an employee just simply doesn't want to come into work, doesn't have a health issue, there's nothing specific that they can show, they haven't tested positive, you know, they can recall them, but wait and see is the note of caution.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, the same question applies to the question, can you mandatorily test employees at the gate, for example? Can you force them to take a test? In most countries, the answer is a clear no, with the exception of the UK and Spain. The biggest problem here is the data privacy laws, how to overcome them. I know many US companies have that tendency to do mandatory testing. We have a couple of clients who have started doing that. Make sure that you are in compliance with data privacy laws when you do so. Another question that we had, and Aaron, please tell me if it's different, is the question of annual leave. I mean, as you all know, in Europe, that's a big thing, and now it's vacation time. And in many companies have already granted the annual leave time, and it's very difficult. Few exceptions in the UK and France where you can deviate a little bit from what you have agreed with your employee. But in most EU states, you cannot postpone the vacation, which puts some companies into trouble because now they have started again production or whatsoever, and they obviously would like to pull everybody into work, but that's almost not possible. The next question we always receive is, can we deviate from the very strict working time laws in Europe? As you might know, there is the maximum of 10 hours a day, a maximum of 48 hours a week. Only France and some smaller countries have agreed to deviate from the working time rules. But in general, this was only for the past, and many companies or many countries have gone back to the normal legal framework of working time. So not much you can do there. And the last very European question is, what can you do with works councils? As you might know, works councils are the employee representation in Europe. Can you do virtual meetings? Yes. In most countries, you can do that anyway, and some countries change their law for the time being in order to make it possible.
I'm happy to jump in. You know, the difference in testing is interesting. Obviously, in the U.S., we also have health privacy laws. The federal government has issued guidance essentially saying that it's permissible to test as people are coming in. Typically, these would be temperature tests because, frankly, the U.S. testing capacity just isn't great. So testing people before they go in is probably a week or two before you get a result. But we are seeing pretty widespread temperature testing, at least as a screen. You know, obviously a best practice, and a lot of employers will have a registered nurse conduct those tests, segregate out all the information, and try to keep that private. But at least we're seeing that in the U.S. And at least here in the U.S., in terms of working hours, there are state laws and some local laws, but we have a little bit more flexibility on that end.
Yes, you do.
Yeah, Gerlind, I'm happy to jump in. Maybe Todd, if you want to go to the next slide, I can kind of,
Yep.
I think there'll be a lot of overlap with what Gerlind talked about. You know, one of the real challenges in the U.S. is if you read any newspaper over the last 3 months or anything online, you'll know that one of the challenges is the real patchwork approach because we have no federal mandate. So you've got various closure orders, everything from, you probably read, Georgia is mandating that no localities can require face masks. So there's no law for face masks in the state of Georgia, despite the fact that their positive rates are really going up. up to places like California and New York. New York obviously had a total closure order. We're reopening. California is reclosing. So the first place to start is obviously with all the latest state workplace closure orders. The federal guidance comes from the CDC and OSHA. They have issued guidelines. They're not mandates, but they're helpful. One of the things under the state closure orders is various workers are classified as essential workers, and if you're an essential worker, then you're able to come into work. What the states have done is they've gradually expanded the definition of essential workers, and I think the best analogy is Governor Cuomo in New York described it as a valve, essentially opening the valve, and as the positive rates go up, which they are currently, those valves are going to be shut down. So, obviously it changes by the day, if not the hour. There's a lot of resources that, I'll give a quick plug. Our firm has been tracking all of these closure orders, and if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to send you a link. It's updated daily. The next issue in terms of the U.S. and deciding whom to recall, and we talked about it, but having an objective process and business case, I think is really important. I already covered that, but it's important to explain to workers, both from an employee relations standpoint, but also in terms of compliance. Why are you requiring workers to come back to the workplace, and do you really need to? Anecdotally, as I said, a lot of offices in New York City, given public transportation, are telling their workers don't expect to come into the office this time and any time this year, at least under a mandate. In the U.S., we have various policies which are typically where we keep our compliance with state, federal, and local laws. So it's important that employers take a look at those policies if they haven't already updated them for various leave laws, workplace safety issues. There have been a significant number of layoffs and recalls, so you want to take a look at those policies and practices, complaint reporting, attendance, work from home policies, anything that may touch upon the current pandemic. If they haven't been updated, then employers will want to do that. Here in the U.S., again, we have this patchwork of federal, state, and federal laws, often conflicting with one another. Achieving 50-state compliance for a lot of employers is a real challenge, something that lawyers such as myself spend a lot of time helping employers get a grip with. Obviously, a lot of state leave laws, a lot of municipalities have passed emergency laws. For instance, New York State has a law that if you have a note from a health authority that you're subject to a quarantine, then you're entitled to 2 weeks of paid leave. That's an emergency new leave law that's just in place. I have 3 emails in my inbox asking me about that from various clients. So obviously that's a big issue right now. Federal, state, and local disability laws, federal laws, the American Disabilities with Act, the ADA, that's touched upon. And then I mentioned before, the other thing we're seeing is the Occupational Safety Health Administration, so that's workplace safety, OSHA, is implicated. At least under the current administration, we're not seeing OSHA being very aggressive. They're not really issuing fines or coming down hard on employers. We are seeing state and local health boards issuing fines, taking enforcement on, so it's important that employers consider all of that. The next consideration from a U.S. perspective is compensation and benefits. Here in the U.S., we have obviously exempt and non-exempt employees. Exempt employees aren't required to be paid overtime for typically working over 40 hours a week. Non-exempt are required to be paid overtime. Huge area of litigation in the U.S. And the reduction in work hours, the reduction in pay has implications for that analysis. So it's a good opportunity for employers to essentially audit their classifications. Also good opportunity to consider and take a look at benefits and fringe benefits plans. A typical issue that I've seen is a lot of benefits plans require some degree of employment, meaning you're working for the company in order to receive certain benefits. Obviously, if employees are in a temporary layoff or furloughed, they may no longer be eligible for benefits under a benefits plan, and then that may not be the intent. So employers are taking a look at that. This issue that the pandemic and working from home is having a big impact on pay equity, disparate impact issues. A lot of decisions were made on the fly, sometimes overnight. The usual slow, reasoned analysis over pay equity and disparate impact issues are implicated. Certainly implicated also as employers are bringing workers back. Is there a plan that doesn't impact unnecessarily certain groups, whether it be in terms of pay or who you're treating more favorably? So those issues are impacted. I grouped a whole bunch of other implications with the return to work, but the U.S. has various WARN Acts, which is duty to give notice prior to termination, severance plans. A lot of employers are using the return to work as an opportunity to take a look at their diversity and inclusion. Immigration laws are implicated. Drug testing laws are implicated. Companies that have unions, their duty to bargain. So there's just a whole host. I could probably go on for a couple hours, but I think that's a good place to leave it and go on to the next slide.
I think when I hear what you're saying, that it's much broader, while we in Europe are already very detailed, and you will find for every European country general guidelines how to do the return to work, and you see here a list of things that need to be done, and you kind of can tick off the box. You start reorganizing the workplace. One of the things we always have to bear in mind is you keep either the 1.5 meters, approximately 5 to 6 feet, or you have to wear a mask. That's rule number one everywhere across Europe. So all the workplaces have to be reorganized along these lines. You have to think about sanitary facilities, common areas, make sure that they don't get overcrowded. You have to think in that regard about working hours and breaks. Many of our clients now do split shifts or have half of the people working from home while the rest is in the office. The same applies to breaks. Make sure that not everybody goes to the cafeteria at lunchtime, but allocate lunchtimes or visits to the cafeteria or to the elevator. So it's very detailed. Even in our office, I can tell you, it's a 10-page instruction what you need to do. Also, when you think about third parties, well, in the first place, don't let them come in. That's the best rule you can follow. But if you have to let them in, make sure that they follow a very strict health and safety protocol. Also, have their names and their data available so you know who is entering your premises. And last but not least, try to think about a policy how to do preventive and occupational health care. That means persons with a higher risk should be able to consult with the company doctor. People who might suffer from mental stress or mental health problems should also be taken into account and be taken care of by the employer. And so I think we have a lot of very detailed rules across Europe. They're pretty much the same. You should follow very diligently. Some of the things I guess are interesting for both areas across the pond. Let's start with the very European thing, works agreements. That's typically a vehicle in order to have a collective agreement with employee representatives in many countries on health and safety issues. And many of our clients have started a process to start consultation to make sure that you have all agreements in place when people return to work. especially when it is, well, what we say, touch up on their personality rights, you need to have an agreement. But then, Aaron, I think the rest is something that we can say applies to both continents. First of all, self-certification. Do you want to give it a start?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, it seems as though this is, and I suspect in the U.S. we're picking up on, European best practices here. But, we are seeing processes, the CDC, our federal government, our federal health or agency has issued actually a template self-certification. So this is becoming standard practice in the U.S. as well. Same here, contact with someone infected in the last 2 weeks, showing symptoms, own health status. Obviously from a compliance standpoint and a risk standpoint, once employers start collecting that information, it is all protected health information. And so, it's important as companies track this and collect it, that they've got processes in place to deal with it. Is that similar to what you're seeing in Europe, Gerlind?
Yeah, I mean, this self-certification by each employee, I think, is used for 2 instances. One is people now returning from vacation in at-risk countries. That's one instances where you need self-certification, and then people who are not feeling well. Where people generally think they might have somehow attracted the virus. And most countries offer a sort of form in order to help employers here. But it's something that, from a legal point of view, where in Europe at least, you always have to look at the data privacy side. This self-certification cannot be used for any other purposes than the virus detection. So you cannot use it in order to go fishing or to understand the general health status of your employees, for example.
Yeah, it certainly be true. We don't have quite the same data privacy compliance risk, but the same impact, right? You don't want to be using this for any other purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we talk about screening and temperature measure. As I said, it's a little bit disputed in Europe. If you want to do it, you need either the consent of the employees in question, or at least have works agreements in place, so on a collective basis. And again, you have to comply with data privacy regulations. Typically, you cannot store the data, for example. You can only measure, and it's, I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, but in Celsius, it's something around 38 degrees Celsius. And then you can say, okay, you need to go home. You cannot write down, okay, Mr. Miller has a high temperature. You just send employees at home, and you cannot record the data.
Yeah, one of the challenges in the U.S., and I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers on my fingertips. I can tell you that the various federal and state guidance have different thresholds. So it's somewhere between 100 degrees up to 100.8, depending on who's giving the guidance. And they're just guidance. So, I mean, you're sort of left, employers, one of the challenges, employers are kind of left to figure it out on their own. But same mechanism. I mean, it's intended as a screening. Obviously, we know that it's not completely foolproof because there's this incubation period when someone may not have a temperature. But obviously, if someone's showing symptoms, it at least is a preventative measure. And then again, all the data privacy and issues. I think the best practice I've seen is having, for companies with large workforces that it's feasible to do this, is they will have a registered nurse at either at the parking lot or at the entrance, taking temperatures, letting people in. That way, it's sort of more of an isolated process. And then we can talk. I'll talk about training and audits. Obviously, again, Europe is further along. We don't have the 10-page manual. It feels like we've got the one sheet, and it's still developing. But certainly training is critical, informing employees what the processes are, controlling it, so not just having a piece of paper, but actually, walking the walk and implementing. And then managing employee fatigue we have here, I think it's really critical as well. Certainly the burnout amongst, different industries is high right now. So it's a critical issue as well.
Interesting. Yeah, training is mandatory. I mean, first of all, you want people understand your rules and procedures, and secondly, it's a liability issue. And I think it's important to do that for liability reasons, and audits need to be done in order to control if you're really effective. Yeah. So I think it's important to follow the rules. Yvonne, I do monitor questions. Is there any question for me?
Yeah, there's the question about vacation in the Q&A section. In the US, some employees do not want to take vacation time since destinations and attractions were closed, and which obviously can increase stress for them. But in the EU countries, it has been agreed upon that vacation leave
that people can leave for vacation.
That people can leave, yeah. But the thing is, in the US, can an employer in the US require an employee to take their vacation?
So that goes
so
to
in
Aaron.
So in the U.S., no, you can't mandate that people go on vacation. You can certainly strongly encourage them. Typically employees will do that. I suppose one of the challenges in the U.S. is, frankly, where do you go if people are stuck in their houses already? But it's important that you make that leave available to the extent that you've got an existing paid time off policy, that employees are fully aware that that's encouraged. There's no punishment. But it's not looked down upon. That's a cultural issue in terms of organizations. That we want you to take downtime to the extent that you can safely go on vacation. You can do that. People are certainly doing that now. And then it's managing when they come back. I mean, in some ways, it's easier in the U.S. because most white-collar industries are still working from home. So, just anecdotally, it'll mean, packing the family in the car and maybe going to a beach house for a week and then coming back to your house. So it's a lot more manageable. But I mean, anecdotally, as places like Disneyland and Disney World open up and you have these large gatherings, it's going to be interesting to see as the summer goes on and the fall goes on. A related issue I'll bring up in the U.S. that is a real challenge, and I don't think anyone has an answer, is schools in the fall. It seems as though a lot of school districts are making the decision to not reopen or to have limited reopening part-time. But as most of the commentators are talking about, it's a workforce issue, because if employees are at home and aren't able to rely on schools for childcare, it has a significant impact on the workforce. I don't know that anyone's got a good answer to that, other than it goes back to the policies and practices so that your employers are managing that process. And I think every employer is aware of it as a problem.
Yeah, I think it's interesting also from a financial point of view. At least in Europe, you have to accrue for vacation time, and as you all probably know, we have 4 to 6 weeks vacation time. So it's a huge amount of accruals. So employers, at least in the first place, were very much interested in employees taking their vacation in Q1 or Q2 specifically, in order to make sure that the accruals would not skyrocket. And now that many companies go back to full productivity, it's the other way around. Employees seek to go on vacation while employers say, hey, can please stay at home. So it's very interesting to see. But the accrual point of view is an important one, at least here in Europe.
Yeah, and I guess the U.S. perspective is, at least not yet, there's no mandatory vacation, so they're treated as fringe benefits. So whatever benefits are subject to policy, those policies sort of become enforceable rights at some point, but it's, we don't see a lot of litigation or enforcement actions over those. I view it more as...
Also, as an employer in Europe, make sure that you have some regulations in place with regard to out-of-office safety. The first thing is to think about business trips. I can tell you they are not very common at the moment. Planes and trains are fairly empty. We all don't know if we ever get back to that, hop on a plane and be here and there for a day or two. I think an employer now has the duty to make video conferences, phone conferences, a viable alternative. And my personal take is we will not go back to the old world in that sense, but we will talk about that in a minute, I guess. Employers shall incentivize employees to keep social distancing outside the office as well. And that was mentioned already. Work from home should be an alternative given to most employees, at least when the commute is too far at the moment, or on a regular basis, not full-time, of course, but as a choice. That's the big discussion here in Europe at the moment. Some legislators even want to make it a right to work from home.
It's interesting. We're not that far, it's sort of the opposite. You've got the state closure orders. So various states are saying you have to work from home. So that's the mandate right now from a safety standpoint. But again, as that valve is being opened up, and so there's no legal restriction on returning to work, it's being left to employers to manage that process. I don't think that any employer in the U.S. would disagree with anything on this slide. They're all, make perfect sense as best practices. Most employers are implementing them. We don't necessarily have the same legal requirement other than just general duty to, protect your employees. Obviously, we are seeing a huge reduction in business travel, a huge increase in phone and video conferences, and we'll talk about it in a moment. But just to preview, I think you're right that the new reality is we're going to be looking at each other over Zoom calls and talking over phone calls for the foreseeable future. The issue in terms of public transportation, just personally in a place like New York City is a real challenge. New York City, San Francisco, Chicago to a lesser extent. These are cities that really rely on public transportation. They're dense. It's difficult to manage. It's going to be interesting to see how those economies look like after this is all, once we're through all of this. From an employer standpoint, again, I can tell you anecdotally, most professional, white-collar office businesses in New York City are telling their employees, we do not expect you to come in this year or indefinitely or foreseeable future. So that's certainly true. In terms of legal compliance for out of the office, there's some older guidance from OSHA that essentially there's no safety requirements around the house. So my law firm doesn't have the duty to make sure this bookshelf doesn't fall on my head behind me. So that's sort of the legal compliance. But obviously there's a lot of thorny issues that are raised with everybody working out of the home.
Yeah, interesting. And I don't go through the slide as such because I think everybody of you can read what needs to be done in suspicious and confirmed cases. What I think is more interesting is the question on remuneration. Do employees get compensated for if they either are absent due to preventive isolation or if they are absent due to being a confirmed case. And I can tell you, even though the details are a little bit different in most countries, I can tell you, yes, most or in almost all countries, there is an entitlement to sick leave benefits, and it doesn't matter who ordered the quarantine. In some cases, it is the employer who has to pay. In other cases, the employer has to pay up front, but get reimbursed by the state. But in any event, there is a scheme in place that in suspicious or confirmed cases, employees get reimbursed. How's it in the US?
It's a good question. It's our typical patchwork approach. So you've got state workers' compensation laws. I believe all 50 states have passed, emergency regulations that a COVID-19 positive qualifies for workers' compensation. It's essentially a government, it's a private employer-funded government safety net that would provide some funding if somebody's out of work. You also have disability insurance, essentially. Some states like New York require employers to carry disability insurance. So like everything else in the US, it's this quasi-private, quasi-public regime that's probably inefficient, but that's for another discussion for another day. And then you do have various local and state paid leave laws. Again, I'll use New York City as an example. New York City mandates up to 5 days of paid sick leave. New York State passed an emergency COVID-19 law. So if somebody's tests positive or is under a quarantine, then they're required to be paid. That's the regime we've got. It probably picks up most of the compensation. I'm sure, like everything else in the U.S., their employees that slip through the cracks, and then, is probably subject to various government benefits at that point.
Mm-hmm. We have the question, what kind of measures employers are taking to mitigate or prevent employment disputes from arising? If we have any proactive models or best practice. If I start here, I'd say the best proactive measure is to communicate with your employees. We have a lot of state run subsidies and a lot of legislation to rule almost on everything, but there are still questions open. Do I have to go back in a case where I'm living together with my 85-year-old infected or not affected parent? It's not clear, that sort of case. And so I think try to communicate, try to settle potential disputes at the beginning. I mean, you should have policies and rules in place, but obviously there might be deviations, and deviations in single cases is always a good thing in order to avoid employment disputes. Aaron,
same advice here generally. I mean, obviously one of the challenges in the U.S. is we are just a much more litigious society.
Yes.
So these disputes tend to get worked out in court or in mediation or arbitration or, once the lawyers get involved. But obviously if companies can prevent those disputes before they get in the hands of the lawyers, that's always better for all parties. I say that as a lawyer. We're waiting to see what types of disputes come up. I mean, I think the general sense is, as a society, we've got probably a bubble of litigations and new claims and new theories that are going to be tested over the months and years to come. Whether that's just because of these health issues, people refusing to work, complaining, and then potential retaliation claims, safety issues. I didn't want to come in. You made me come in. I tested positive. God forbid, a family member became ill. Those types of claims. I think we're just starting to see. We're tracking those cases. Probably in the entire U.S., under 100 cases have been filed total. I would just as a rough estimate, but we will see what legal precedent is set and what the standards are for resolving those cases, and then we'll see. But the same guidance, Gerlind, that you gave is it all comes down to good employee relations, communication, keeping your employees happy, keeping them aware of what's going on, communicating, being honest, being transparent, listening to issues, responding to issues, all of the best practices that, a good human resources or employee relations manager would put in place in any time, certainly all come into place. It's just heightened need and demand because of the emergency of the pandemic.
Yeah.
I saw one question actually from, I think it was from Yvonne. I'll just respond to quickly. How do you monitor fraud with people working from home in the U.S.? I mean, it's more of an issue with hourly workers. It's a real challenge, and it's a challenge that you hear. And I guess that's one of the business cases that you're hearing employers mandating their employees to come back because they feel like their employees are being less productive. There's a lot of technological systems in place. When you log into your computer, you've got to sort of check in, and there's monitoring. Those are probably the best solutions to that. I suppose it's just part of the risk and part of accepting. If you want your employees working, you've got to be more flexible. It may not necessarily be fraud. It may be, again, I'll give you an anecdote. I had to call my bank for something, and I could hear the woman's newborn, there in the background, and it was of course perfectly fine. But I think that there's just so many employees right now who are trying to manage, childcare issues, that I think most reasonable employers are just being more flexible on requirements.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, maybe we come to our last question, that is the outlook. What do we see for the future? And I think it's worthwhile spending a little bit on lessons learned. I think there was even though most companies nowadays feel, they made it, they managed somehow, I think you can see an organizational weakness underlined by the pandemic. Many companies did have little or no leverage to manage the sudden drop of activity, to manage people in their respective homes. We saw a sort of breakdown of leadership, and from a legal point of view, almost no employment contract had a work from home clause in it. So I think that's a problem. So I think, and last but not least, maybe not in the US, but in Europe, a lack of digitization. So I would hope for a new world where the next wave or a new pandemic can be tackled from day one with this sort of resilience in place.
Yeah, it's pretty similar here. It felt like, and it feels like, a huge stress test for the compliance. I mean, for 2 weeks, it just felt like everybody running around in circles with their hair on fire. It settled down. Practices and policies got in place. One of the advantages of a firm like us in terms of the legal compliance is, some of the issues are across the board. So we were able to develop templates that were compliant, that we could share with employers. But, we got the same question, as these workplace orders kicked in, a lot of companies were just figuring out, do we really have to comply? What is this going to mean? And I get it. And I get it then and I get it now. I mean, these are existential threats to businesses. And so, I'm sure Europe feels the same way, but certainly here in the U.S., it seems as though, especially as numbers increase, there's a significant health component to this crisis, and it's still being felt and it's real. There's also a real economic impact as well. And it doesn't feel like we've really digested that yet. I can say anecdotally, we're going to be feeling that. You know, the new reality, I agree with you, Gerlind. It's work from home. It's updating policies. It's trying to get a grips of what this new reality looks like. But it seems as though there's still an impact to be felt, whether that be in litigation or the economic impact or you know, across the board, everything we've talked about. Be curious to see if we've got maybe a couple more questions maybe we can deal with, or maybe it's a good point to get to our survey. What do you think, Yvonne?
Yeah, I think we should launch the survey and then see. There's another question that we have from the audience. Given the patchwork of regulation in the US, what agencies are mandated to ensure employers are maintaining safe practices in the workplace?
It's a good question. Well, we'll start at the local. You know, you've got local health boards. Then at the state level, you've got state health boards. It seems as though the local and state boards are the ones that are more active. I'm finding, or I'm just seeing anecdotally, you know, unless it's an egregious violation, you know, these bars that are open and with no restrictions, and it's just like a petri dish, unless it's truly egregious, most of the state and local health boards are trying to work with employers to ensure compliance. So it's a more of a carrot rather than a stick approach. And then at the federal level, you've got OSHA, the Occupational Safety Health Administration, that's really in charge. You know, there's been anecdotal reporting that OSHA hasn't issued a single citation during the pandemic. You know, it's reflective of the political views of the current administration that they're not going to punish employers. But those are the various levels that you've got. And then again, just you've got the private right of action in terms of, you know, this wave of litigation I think we're going to see. So, you know, best practices is always compliance. So, you know, I mean, you know, so that if an inspector or an auditor comes knocking on your door, you can point to all your policies and practice. So it's not only good for your employees, you know, it also helps with the compliance.
Yeah, I mean, we talked, if I may ask another question, we talked about, you know, working from home and allowing people to work from home. It's allowing employers to work from home is one thing, but a lot of people can't work from home. So, you know, is this going to be a question in an interview where you sass out if someone can work from home if the need arises? And if this is, you know, it's like I work in a high rise. I live in a high rise. I work and live in a high rise. I live in a high rise in New York, and a lot of my neighbors are, you know, young executives, and they're teaming up, you know, 3 to 4 in an apartment. Working from home is really not, you know, a good setup for them. So are they at a disadvantage being hired going forward?
Gerlind, you want to respond to that? Or I'm happy to jump in.
Well, I don't picture this question being asked in Europe. It would be too personal. And at least in Europe, at the moment, it's being sold as an entitlement, not as a duty or an obligation. And as I said in the beginning, I know that some financial controllers are already measuring the office space, how to reduce it by 30%. But so far, it's being seen as a benefit and not as an obligation.
I think that's probably true in the U.S. as well. You know, it's just this assumption that people have this ability to do it. You know, you do have this expectation that the employer is going to take steps to set you up, you know, provide, you know, make sure you've got a connection, all of the technological, but I view it that way. I mean, the bigger societal question is, and this is way more than we can tackle in the 2 minutes we have left, is, you know, the essential workers who have been coming in, you know, for the most part, tend to be people of color and protected classes and just can't afford to. So there's this huge implication that much smarter people than me, I know are really grappling with. So, and I don't have any answers to it other than I see it as a real challenge because, you know, it tends to be professional people who have the ability, both financially, but then also in terms of their job duties, that they can work from home, and then obviously that's safer.
Yeah, we have another question. How are employers looking at, on both sides of the Atlantic, handling personal costs? You know, phone use
associated with working from home. Yeah. There is no law, at least to my knowledge, that requires employers to take care of it. But as a general rule, I would say it's an expense. So you just interpret the current law, and many companies have given an allowance, a home office allowance of say €50 a month as a ballpark figure.
The U.S., like everything else, is a patchwork. So under federal law, unless expenses drop an hourly worker below minimum wage, there's no requirement. States have various requirements. California requires reimbursement, for instance. New York doesn't. So it depends. Same as, you know, same answer as what Gerlind gave. I mean, a lot of employers, especially large employers, are finding ways to compensate. Obviously, it's to the company's benefit that their employees can access and, you know, have free access. So that's the standard.
Let me step in here, if I might, and I'm going to share the results of this poll, if I can figure out how to do that. Thanks everybody who responded. So you'll see the questions were related to when are you prepared to do some of these different activities personally, not company policies and so forth. And you'll see return full-time to my workplace. Almost half have said they're going to wait until there's a vaccine or an effective treatment, and then the other responses there. A majority of people said they might be willing to attend a small work-related seminar, but only a third. And interesting to see, you know, the spread of answers there. For larger events, again, well over almost 2/3 have said that they would not attend a large event until there's a vaccine or an effective treatment. A big conference, seminar, dinner, you know, almost 85% have said nope, and next year, and nobody's interested in doing this through the end of the year. Domestic travel, you know, we didn't specify here if this is air, road, so forth, but again, a little more willingness to try in some of those things. But internationally, again, people are not traveling internationally. They're not prepared to do it in the near future. Looks like they're going to wait until next year or until there's a vaccine or effective treatment. So very interesting to see those results. So.
Yeah, I think the international travel is also hindered. You don't know if you need to go in quarantine when you get there.
Okay, well, I think we are at the top of the hour. Was there any closing remarks, or shall I just close this down?
Aaron, Gerlind?
Yeah, just thank you all, and thank you, Yvonne, Todd, and Gerlind. I mean, this feels like we could do it again next week and cover totally new topics. Maybe we should do it again.
Yeah. If you have questions to Aaron and myself, send us an email. Happy to answer, and stay safe over the pond.
There you go. Yeah.
Stay safe. Wear a mask.
We will be sharing the results, the slides, which do include Gerlind's and Aaron's contact information. We'll also put the survey results into that message. Again, obviously not a scientific survey, but just, you know, interesting to see attitudes. So that concludes today's webinar entitled, Will Return to Work Take Us Back or to the Future? We want to offer our deepest thanks to Aaron Warshaw from OGLETREE DEAKINS and Gerlind Wisskirchen from CMS for sharing your experience and your insight. And of course, thanks to all of our audience for joining in today's discussion. Just a reminder, all comments and opinions presented by our speakers today are their own, and they do not necessarily represent the views of the European American Chamber of Commerce or of its members. I'd encourage you to stay in touch with your local chapter of the European American Chamber of Commerce for information on upcoming webinars and other events. And be sure to look for a recording of this and other EACC webinars and events on our YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining us, and farewell.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.